There is a study that wildlife biologists did not set out to conduct. It emerged from data collected for other purposes, from radio collar telemetry gathered across multiple years in a range system in the American West. And when the researchers began examining the behavioral trajectories of individual mountain lions that had been tracked from cubhood into adulthood, they found something that none of the original study parameters had been designed to detect. The cubs that had the most documented exposure to humans during their developmental period, the ones whose collar data and camera trap records showed repeated proximity to human activity during the months when their mothers were teaching them to hunt and navigate and survive, those cubs became, as adults, statistically and behaviorally distinct from mountain lions raised in low-contact wild conditions. They approached humans more closely. They retreated later and at shorter distances. They were overrepresented in incident reports. They were overrepresented in the records of livestock depredation and domestic animal predation. And in the subset of the study population that eventually had to be euthanized for posing a direct safety risk to people, the proportion of individuals with high human exposure histories in their first year of life was not random. It was a signal, a quiet, methodical, data-confirmed signal that the wildlife biology community has not broadly publicized and that the public has almost certainly never heard. If you find the intersection of animal behavior and what it means for the future of wild predators moving through human landscapes genuinely important, consider subscribing now, because this channel covers exactly this kind of story, the ones buried in telemetry data and field reports and management records that never make the evening news, but that tell you more about where things are heading than any headline ever will. What the radio collar study uncovered belongs to a body of science that is slowly accumulating around a deceptively simple question. Mountain lions almost never attack people. That is the foundational fact. The historical record makes it clear, the statistics confirm it, and the biology provides an explanation for it that is genuinely sophisticated and genuinely reassuring. But within that rarity, something is changing. Not in the gross numbers, not in a way that makes walking in mountain lion country the equivalent of a reckless act, but in the pattern beneath the numbers, in the behavioral signatures of the animals involved in incidents, in the demographic characteristics of the lions that present elevated risk. And the radio collar data from developmental exposure research adds a dimension to that picture that goes deeper than habitat overlap or population growth, or drought-driven prey decline. It goes into the formative experience of the animal itself, into the months of a mountain lion cub's life when its nervous system is building the templates that will govern its behavior for the rest of its existence. And it asks a question that nobody thought to ask until the data made it unavoidable. What happens to a mountain lion that grows up watching humans, not being hurt by them, not chased, not threatened, just watched? What does that observational learning do to the animal's assessment of what humans are? And what does that assessment look like when the cub is no longer a cub, when it weighs 150 pounds and hunts mule deer in the dark, and moves through a landscape where humans are a constant, unremarkable presence that has never, in its entire lived experience, done anything to suggest it should be feared? The answer the data produced was not the answer anyone expected, because the dominant assumption in wildlife biology had been that mountain lions are largely asocial learners when it comes to their relationship with humans. The assumption was that habituation was an individual process. A lion moved through human terrain, experienced no negative consequences, and gradually reduced its wariness in response to that individual experience. What the collar data challenged was the assumption that this process begins with the adult lion's own direct experience. What it suggested instead was that some component of the habituation process begins earlier, in the developmental period, through a mechanism that is not direct experience, but observation. And observation, as any student of animal learning will tell you, is not a passive process. It is a form of learning with its own neural substrate, its own developmental windows, and its own long-term behavioral consequences that can be meaningfully distinct from what direct experience produces. To understand why developmental exposure matters in a way that adult habituation does not fully capture, you have to understand something about how mountain lion cubs learn. Mountain lions are not born knowing how to hunt. They are born with the neurological architecture for it, with the reflexes and the prey detection systems and the motor programs that will eventually execute the killing bite with professional precision. But those systems require calibration. They require the acquisition of prey-specific knowledge that tells the growing cub what the world contains, what is prey and what is not, what is dangerous and what is not, what the appropriate response to different categories of stimulus should be. This calibration happens during a developmental window that spans roughly the first 12 to 18 months of the cub's life, the period during which it travels with its mother, observes her hunting, begins making its own attempts, and absorbs the structure of the world through direct experience and through watching the animal it most closely attends to in those crucial months. The mother's behavioral responses to stimuli in the environment function, for the cub, as a kind of annotated guide to the world. When she smells a coyote and moves away, the cub learns something about coyotes. When she detects a human and melts into cover and waits, unmoving and tense, until the human is gone, the cub learns something about humans. It learns that humans are stimuli that require concealment, caution, and avoidance. It learns that the appropriate response to a human is to disappear. This is the developmental encoding of the wariness that keeps wild mountain lions invisible and safe and behaviorally constrained in their interactions with people. The cubs of wild mothers who hunt in wild terrain and respond to human presence with the full avoidance response grow up with that response built into their behavioral architecture at a foundational level. Now consider what happens when the mother's response to humans is different. Not aggressive, not predatory toward humans, just different, less urgent, less complete. Consider a female mountain lion who has spent 3 years hunting in a range system that is increasingly penetrated by trails, fire roads, residential development, and human recreational activity. She has been exposed to hundreds of human encounters that ended without negative consequence. Her flight distance from humans has shortened through the habituation process that the literature documents clearly. She still avoids close contact. She still treats humans as something to be circumspect about. But her behavioral response to their presence has been modulated. She does not vanish with the same urgency. She does not hold her position in cover with the same rigidity. She is, in measurable behavioral terms, less afraid. And when her cubs travel with her through that landscape and observe her responses to the humans they encounter, what they are learning is a different lesson than the cubs of fully wild mothers are learning. They are learning that humans are things that require mild caution rather than maximum concealment. They are learning a behavioral template in which the appropriate response to human presence is something less urgent and less complete than the full avoidance response. And they are encoding that lesson during the developmental window when the brain is most receptive to it, when the calibration of the predatory and threat assessment systems is most plastic, when what is observed becomes what is expected, and expectation becomes the baseline against which all future experience is measured. This is the mechanism that the radio collar study illuminated. Not that cubs directly learn to hunt humans, not that anything so dramatic or purposeful is happening in the developmental period. What is happening is subtler and in some ways more consequential. The cubs of habituated mothers are calibrating their threat assessment systems with a human presence that carries reduced threat valence. When those cubs become adults and enter the world independently, the threshold at which they treat humans as a signal requiring avoidance is set at a different level than it is for wild conditioned adults. They will get closer before retreating. They will take longer to leave. they will be more likely to return to areas with human activity, and in the conditions of nutritional stress and competitive pressure that are increasingly common in a fragmented and densely humanized landscape, that difference in threshold is not trivial. It is the difference between an adult mountain lion that encounters a trail runner and dissolves into the chaparral, and an adult mountain lion that stops and watches the trail runner pass at 40 yards and does not move at all. The collar data made this visible in a way that prior observational research had not been equipped to do. When you have continuous location data on an individual from the point of its first recorded collar event as a cub through years of adult life, you can construct a behavioral trajectory. You can see how the animal's relationship to human-dominated terrain changes over time. You can see what its exposure history looks like during the developmental period. And when you cross-reference that trajectory with the incident record, with depredation reports and observation reports and encounter reports, you begin to see patterns that are invisible in cross-sectional data but unmistakable in longitudinal analysis. The animals with the densest human exposure records during the first year of life were not uniformly more dangerous as adults. Most of them lived their adult lives in the same ambiguous zone of reduced wariness, without ever crossing into active conflict with humans. But among the animals that did cross into conflict, the proportion with high developmental exposure was dramatically elevated relative to what you would expect from random distribution across the study population. The signal was not proof of a mechanism. It was consistent with a mechanism, and the mechanism it pointed to was observational learning during the developmental window, the acquisition, through watching a less wary mother in a human-penetrated landscape, of a threat assessment calibration that sets the human wariness threshold lower than wild rearing would. The implications of this finding extend well beyond the immediate question of individual lion behavior, because they point toward a generational dynamic that is not captured in the standard framework for thinking about mountain lion habituation and attack risk. The standard framework is essentially individualist. A mountain lion habituates through its own experience. It either does or does not enter into conflict with humans based on its own individual history and circumstances. Management response is directed at individuals. Remove the problem animal. The population continues. The next animal's trajectory is independent of the removed animals. This framework is not wrong. It accurately describes a real mechanism. But it is incomplete if the radio collar data is telling us something real about developmental transmission of behavioral dispositions. If cubs in human-adjacent territory are consistently being raised by mothers whose reduced wariness is being incorporated into the cub's own threat assessment calibration, then the habituation process is not only running at the individual level through direct experience, it is running at a generational level through observational learning during development, and it is potentially cumulative across generations in ways that individual removal does not interrupt. A female mountain lion that has become moderately habituated to humans raises cubs that begin their lives with a baseline wariness level that is already lower than the wild default. Those cubs, as adults, experience further habituation through their own direct experience. If they reproduce, their own cubs begin the cycle with a baseline lower still. The trajectory across multiple generations in a population that is not dispersing out of human-adjacent habitat and is not experiencing sufficient negative conditioning to push wariness levels back up, is toward a progressive and directional shift in the population's behavioral relationship to humans that individual removal of problem animals does not address. This is the part of the story that nobody expected the radio collar study to tell, because the study was not designed to look for it. It was designed to look at territory size, prey selection, movement patterns, and inter-individual interactions. The developmental exposure question emerged from an analyst who noticed that the early life location data for certain problem animals shared a consistent pattern and who decided to run the comparison that the data made possible. The result was an analysis that appears in the supplementary materials of a paper focused on other questions, in the dry, careful language that scientific publishing requires, with appropriately hedged conclusions and appropriate caveats about sample size and alternative explanations. It has not been covered by wildlife media. It has not been cited in official risk communications. It sits in a dataset that professionals in the field are aware of and that the public has no access to and no reason to know about. The reason it matters now is the same reason the other structural changes in the human mountain lion interface matter now. The conditions that produced it are not diminishing, they are expanding. The proportion of mountain lion habitat in the American West that is penetrated by human activity, by trails, roads, residential development, recreational infrastructure, is growing. The proportion of mountain lion cubs being raised by mothers who navigate human-dominated terrain as a routine part of their lives is growing accordingly. The population of mothers with the behavioral profile that the collar data identifies as associated with elevated developmental exposure in cubs, that is, mothers with reduced flight distances and reduced urgency in their responses to human presence, is the population that human landscape expansion is continuously enlarging. This is not a future risk. It is a current condition that is currently producing the next generation of mountain lions in the areas of highest human-wildlife overlap, and the behavioral trajectories of those animals will not fully express themselves in the incident record for another 3 to 5 years, when the cubs being raised right now reach adulthood and begin their independent lives in a landscape that their developmental experience has already told them is one in which humans are not particularly alarming. The geography of this problem is not uniform. It is concentrated in the places where mountain lion habitat and human development have become most deeply interwoven, and those places have specific characteristics that are worth naming because they are the places where the management and conservation choices of the next decade will matter most. The coastal ranges of California represent the most intensively documented version of the situation. The Santa Ana Mountains, the Santa Cruz Mountains, the Diablo Range, the transverse ranges north of Los Angeles. In all of these systems, the GPS collar data that has been accumulating over the past 15 to 20 years tells a consistent story. Female mountain lions are raising cubs in terrain where human recreational use is heavy and continuous. The cubs are growing up with extensive observational experience of humans. The adults those cubs become are consistently less wary than their counterparts in the Sierra Nevada, in the Cascades, in the more remote portions of the Rocky Mountain system, where human penetration of mountain lion habitat is less complete and less continuous. Colorado presents a different version of the same basic dynamic. The Front Range, the corridor of urban and suburban development that runs along the eastern slope of the Rockies from Pueblo to Fort Collins, has expanded dramatically over the past 30 years. The mountain lion habitat that abuts that development is not remote. It is the foothills terrain that the lions have occupied for as long as the species has existed in the region, and which the human population has been moving into at an accelerating rate. The lions that live in those foothills are not intruders into human space. The humans are intruders into lion space, and the lions, characteristically, have responded to that intrusion by adapting. They have adapted by reducing their wariness. They have adapted by shifting their activity timing, by using drainage corridors and riparian areas that provide cover within developed terrain, by taking domestic prey when natural prey becomes temporarily less available. And they are raising cubs in that terrain, cubs that are absorbing the developmental lessons that the terrain offers about what humans are and what they require by way of behavioral response. Washington State has been watching a version of this dynamic play out in the Cascades foothills and in the areas west of the Cascades, where recreational trail use and residential expansion have brought a growing human population into sustained contact with a healthy and expanding mountain lion population. The incident record in Washington over the past decade shows a pattern consistent with what California and Colorado have documented: more close encounters, more daylight encounters, more encounters involving animals that do not respond to human presence with the immediacy and completeness of avoidance that wildlife managers associate with wild-conditioned lions. More encounters involving young adults that show behavioral profiles consistent with reduced developmental wariness. The numbers are still small. They are small enough that any individual incident can be reported as an isolated anomaly. The pattern they form is not anomalous. British Columbia and Alberta have added data from the northern end of the range that is in some ways the most instructive because it comes from areas where human development in mountain lion habitat is less advanced than in California or Colorado, providing something like a comparison baseline. Mountain lions in the more remote portions of these provinces exhibit the behavioral profile that wildlife managers historically associated with the species as a whole. They are wary. They avoid humans consistently. When they have cubs, the cubs grow up in terrain where human encounters are infrequent and where the mother's response to those encounters is the full, urgent avoidance behavior that transmits maximum wariness to the developing cubs. The incident record in remote British Columbia and Alberta mountain lion habitat is essentially flat. The incident record in the zones of these provinces where recreational use and resource extraction activity have created sustained human presence in lion habitat is not flat. It shows the same upward trend that the American data shows, at a scale consistent with the lower level of human-wildlife interface development in those regions. The prey-switching dynamic that accompanies developmental habituation is a critical component of the picture, and one that the radio collar study data illuminated with particular clarity, because the collar data includes not just location, but hunting success records derived from GPS cluster analysis. When a mountain lion makes a kill, it stays in a small area for an extended period while it feeds. The GPS clusters that result from this behavior are identifiable in the collar data, and when the species composition of the kills is analyzed across the study population, the animals with high developmental human exposure histories show a different prey profile than wild-conditioned animals. Not dramatically different, not absent of the deer and other ungulates that constitute the core diet for mountain lions across their range, but different in ways that are statistically detectable. Higher rates of domestic animal predation, higher rates of kills in terrain close to human habitation, higher rates of kills occurring in daylight hours, which wild-conditioned mountain lions rarely make, preferring the low-light conditions that are standard for crepuscular and nocturnal hunters, and a prey size profile that, in the most habituated individuals, shows a distribution shifted slightly toward the smaller end of what mountain lions are capable of killing. These are not direct indicators of human attack risk. They are indicators of a behavioral flexibility that, in the conditions where developmental habituation intersects with nutritional stress, represents the constellation of factors most consistently associated with the animals that eventually do present a direct risk to people. The small prey dimension of this is worth dwelling on because it connects to the children and dog issue in a way that the public communication on mountain lion risk has not made explicit. A mountain lion that has shifted, even partially, towards smaller prey items as a function of its behavioral flexibility and its reduced wariness of the human-dominated terrain where smaller prey is abundant, is an animal whose predatory experience is being continuously reinforced around prey targets that overlap in size with young children and large domestic dogs. It is not making a conceptual connection between a domestic dog and a child. Mountain lion cognition does not work that way, and anthropomorphizing it in that direction is both scientifically inaccurate and unhelpful. What it is doing is reinforcing predatory routines in terrain and at size ranges that happen to put its functional predatory behavior in proximity to humans and human-associated animals, in ways that a lion hunting exclusively large ungulates in remote terrain does not experience. The predatory template, built and reinforced by thousands of actual kills, is being shaped by experience in human-adjacent terrain, in ways that have consequences for what triggers the predatory sequence and what does not. The children who are most at risk in the peri-urban mountain lion interface are not at risk because mountain lions target children specifically. They are at risk because the intersection of several factors creates conditions in which the normal behavioral constraints on predatory behavior toward humans are most likely to be simultaneously weakened in the same animal at the same time. Size, specifically the size of a young child relative to the prey that a habituated, nutritionally flexible lion has been successfully hunting, matters because prey recognition is partly size-mediated. Movement pattern matters because children move in ways that are less predictable and in certain phases of play can approximate the erratic movement of injured or juvenile ungulates in ways that adult human movement does not. Sound profile matters because young children produce high-pitched vocalizations that fall in frequency ranges that overlap with prey distress calls in ways that adult human speech does not. And the inability to mount an effective behavioral deterrent response, to make oneself large and loud and directly confrontational in the way that adult humans can, matters because the behavioral deterrent is the primary mechanism by which humans override the predatory assessment of a habituated lion that is at close range. None of these factors alone is sufficient to explain an attack, but in combination, in a specific animal that has the developmental and experiential background that the collar study identifies, they constitute a risk profile that is meaningfully different from the baseline. The management community knows this. The researchers who work in human-wildlife interface ecology know this. The information exists in the scientific literature, in management reports, in the gray literature of wildlife agency internal documents and the supplementary data of published studies. What does not exist, or exists only in nascent and localized form, is a coherent public communication strategy that conveys this information honestly, with appropriate statistical context, without either minimizing the genuine rarity of serious mountain lion attacks or overstating the risk in ways that produce public hysteria, political backlash against mountain lion conservation, or the kind of reflexive calls for hunting program expansion that are the predictable political response to any wildlife incident that receives significant media coverage. The challenge of communicating this honestly is real and should not be dismissed as simple institutional cowardice or public relations management. The history of public response to carnivore risk communication in North America includes some genuinely destructive episodes. The bounty systems that nearly eliminated mountain lion populations across the American West in the early 20th century were partly driven by a public risk narrative that bore little relationship to actual statistical risk, but that translated directly into policy, with devastating conservation consequences. The decision in California to pursue a full hunting ban in 1990 was partly a reaction against decades of wildlife management communication that had understated mountain lion populations and biological needs in ways that the voting public eventually rejected entirely. Risk communication about large predators operates in a political environment where the stakes of getting the framing wrong are genuinely high, for the animals as much as for the people. And wildlife managers are not wrong to be careful. They are wrong, increasingly wrong as the conditions change, to let carefulness about framing translate into an incomplete account of what the data is showing. What an honest account looks like is not a warning that mountain lions are becoming human predators. They are not. The baseline of rarity is not being overturned. What an honest account looks like is an acknowledgement that within that baseline of rarity, The behavioral conditions are shifting in ways that are documented and directional, and that have identifiable structural causes that management policy can address. It acknowledges that the developmental exposure pathway documented in the radio collar data represents a mechanism that individual removal of problem adults does not interrupt. It acknowledges that the generational transmission of reduced wariness, if the structural conditions producing it are not addressed, produces a slow directional shift in population behavior that the current management framework does not have tools to reverse. And it acknowledges that the places where these conditions are most advanced are the places where the incident record is already showing the leading edge of what a more fully expressed version of this shift produces. The structural interventions that could address the conditions are known. Wildlife corridors that restore dispersal connectivity to isolated populations relieve the demographic pressure that pushes young animals into human-adjacent terrain and keeps them there. Negative conditioning programs that systematically reintroduce the experience of humans as threatening stimuli to lions in high-exposure areas have been piloted in some jurisdictions with results that are promising at the individual level, though the practicality of scaling them to population level is contested. Prey management that maintains ungulate populations in mountain lion territories at levels that reduce nutritional stress and reduce the motivation for the behavioral flexibility that leads to domestic prey and the human proximity that comes with it. Recreational use management that modifies trail design and access rules in areas identified as high developmental exposure zones for mountain lion cubs. Not to eliminate human recreational use, but to reduce the intensity and consistency of human presence during the periods and in the areas where mountain lion females with cubs are most active. None of these are simple interventions. None of them are currently being implemented at the scale that the collar data suggests they need to be. Some of them are in early stages of policy discussion in the jurisdictions with the most advanced human-wildlife interface problems. Most of them are not. The trail running community, the hiking community, the communities of parents with children who live and play in peri-urban mountain lion habitat, all have a legitimate interest in this information and a right to receive it in a form that allows them to make informed behavioral choices. The behavioral guidance that wildlife agencies provide for encounters with mountain lions is well established and genuinely effective. Stand your ground, make yourself large, make direct eye contact, make noise, do not run, fight back if attacked. This guidance derives from the same behavioral logic that the developmental exposure research reinforces from a different angle. It exploits the fact that confident, upright, confrontational human behavior does not match the prey template that mountain lions have built from their prey experience. For a wild, conditioned adult mountain lion, the full deterrent response reliably triggers retreat. For a developmentally habituated adult mountain lion, that logic still holds. The deterrent response still works, but the threshold at which it needs to be deployed may be different because the animal's assessment of the stimulus that prompts it has been set at a different baseline. The habituated lion gets closer before it assesses. The encounter window in which the deterrent response needs to operate is therefore shorter, and the need for it may arise in circumstances: daylight, residential terrain, the backyard rather than the backcountry, where people are less prepared to deploy it. This is the practical implication that falls out of the developmental exposure research and that is missing from the standard risk communication. The guidance is right, the behavioral protocol is correct, but the spatial and temporal distribution of situations in which it needs to be applied is no longer accurately described by the historical picture of the remote, low-light, backcountry encounter. The encounters that the developmental habituation dynamic is producing occur in different places and at different times than the historical encounter profile suggested. They occur in daylight, because habituated lions are less active period restricted than wild conditioned lions. They occur in peri-urban terrain, because that is where the habituated population is concentrated. They occur closer to residential development, because the lions whose developmental experience has calibrated them to reduced human wariness are comfortable in terrain that wild conditioned lions avoid. The people who need to be prepared to execute the behavioral deterrent protocol are not only the solo trail runner in the backcountry at dawn, they are the parents supervising children in a backyard adjacent to mountain lion corridor habitat. They are the dog walker on the Greenbelt Trail that borders a residential subdivision. They are the homeowner who has been told by neighbors that a mountain lion has been seen in the area 3 times in the past month. These people are not being given, in most jurisdictions, the specific and location-relevant information that would allow them to understand their actual current risk profile rather than the historical average risk profile that the boilerplate language about extreme rarity describes. The observation behavior of the cubs themselves is worth examining as a specific phenomenon because it is the piece of the mechanism that the collar study made most visible and that is hardest to intuit from first principles. Mountain lion cubs spend between 12 and 18 months in intensive association with their mother before she drives them off to establish independent lives. During that period, the cubs are not merely passive passengers on their mother's journeys through the landscape. They are active observers and active learners who are building, through observation and practice, the complete behavioral repertoire they will need to survive alone. They observe their mother's hunting attempts, including the failed ones. They observe her navigation decisions, including how she chooses to move through terrain with different characteristics. They observe her responses to threats and stimuli, including conspecifics, other predators, and humans. And they practice. They make play hunting attempts on small prey. They begin accompanying the mother on hunts in ways that shift from observation to participation. By the time they are driven off, they have extensive observational experience with every major category of stimulus in the range their mother occupies. The humans in that range, if it is a human-penetrated range, have been encountered and observed. The mother's response to those encounters has been recorded by the cubs with the same fidelity that they record her hunting techniques and her navigational choices. The precision of observational learning in felids is well documented in the captive literature and increasingly supported by field data in wild populations. Cubs learn prey handling techniques from their mothers. They learn hunting strategies specific to particular prey types. They learn the behavioral repertoire associated with territorial defense and inter-individual communication. All of this learning occurs through observation of the mother's behavior, complemented by practice and reinforced by outcome. The same learning system that allows a cub to observe its mother, execute a suffocation bite on a mule deer, and reproduce that technique with increasing precision in its own hunting attempts is the learning system that records the mother's response to a human hiker and encodes it as a template for appropriate response to that stimulus category. The accuracy of that encoding depends on the signal clarity of the mother's behavior. A mother that executes the full avoidance response, that treats the human as a high-priority threat signal requiring immediate and complete concealment, transmits a clear and strong signal about the appropriate response to the stimulus. A mother whose response is attenuated, who treats the human as a low-level stimulus requiring mild caution rather than full concealment, transmits a different signal. And the cub's threat assessment calibration for humans is built from that signal just as accurately as if the signal were the full avoidance response. The learning system does not evaluate the adaptive appropriateness of what it is recording. It records what it observes, and what it observes in a human-penetrated landscape with a habituated mother is a version of human wariness that is meaningfully different from what wild-conditioned cubs are recording in less developed terrain. The timescales involved in this process are what make it particularly consequential from a management perspective. A female mountain lion that has become habituated to human presence through several years of living in human-adjacent terrain has 1, 2, sometimes 3 litters of cubs during that period. Each litter spends the developmental window in a range that is continuously penetrated by human activity, with a mother whose behavioral responses to that activity are already attenuated. The cubs of those litters reach adulthood 2 to 3 years after they are born. They are entering the adult population now, with behavioral profiles shaped by the developmental experience described above. The litters being raised in this landscape right now will reach adulthood in 2 to 3 years. The litters that will be raised in this landscape, as it continues to expand, will reach adulthood in 5, 7, 10 years. The time lag between the developmental experience that shapes the behavioral profile and the expression of that profile in the adult incident record means that the current incident record is telling you something about what was happening in this landscape 2 to 3 years ago. It is not telling you what the developmental experience of the current cub cohort is going to produce when those animals reach adulthood. For that, you have to look at the current conditions in the developmental landscape, at the current distribution of habituated females with cubs in human-penetrated terrain, and extrapolate forward. The picture that extrapolation produces is not catastrophic, but it is directional in a way that is inconsistent with the flat risk baseline that most public communication continues to imply. There is a parallel in the history of wolf management in the Northern Rockies that illuminates the structural logic of what the mountain lion situation involves, without mapping onto it precisely. When wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone and central Idaho in the mid-1990s, the wildlife management community had extensive data on wolf behavior in Canadian populations that had never lost their wariness of humans. The wolves that were reintroduced brought that wariness with them. Over the first decade of reintroduction, the behavioral profile of those wolves and their offspring was consistent with the wild condition profile. As the population expanded and wolves began colonizing territories in areas of greater human activity, in the zones around the park boundaries, and in the agricultural landscapes of the surrounding states, behavioral differentiation began to appear. Wolves from territories with high human exposure began to show different patterns from wolves in remote core territories. The behavioral differences were not as dramatic as some predictions had suggested, and not as trivial as optimistic assessments had hoped. They were real and measurable and consistent with the habituation mechanisms that behavioral ecology predicted. The wolves that had the most problematic interactions with people and livestock were consistently animals from territories with high human exposure histories. The management response, which included lethal removal of problem individuals and non-lethal conditioning programs in high-conflict areas, was an ongoing and imperfect negotiation with a dynamic situation rather than a solved problem. The mountain lion situation in the American West shares the structural logic of this story without sharing its specific characteristics, and it is approaching a scale of landscape penetration and generational habituation cycling that makes the wolf comparison worth taking seriously as an indicator of what the next 20 years of management will require. The camera trap data that has accumulated alongside the collar data in the major mountain lion study systems has added a dimension of behavioral documentation that collar data alone cannot provide, because it captures the actual behavioral sequences that the collar data can only locate in space and time. What the camera trap record shows in the areas of high human-wildlife interface is consistent with and complementary to the collar story. Mountain lions, including females with cubs, are being recorded in close proximity to human activity with a frequency and a behavioral casualness that researchers describe as distinctly different from what the camera trap record shows in remote areas. The cubs in those recordings are not behaving like animals in the presence of a threatening stimulus. They are behaving like animals in the presence of an unremarkable feature of the environment. A cub that sits and watches a hiker walk past at 60 meters, with the relaxed body posture and the casual attentiveness that the camera trap captures, is not in a state of arousal. It is not poised to flee. It is observing, with the kind of interested detachment that a cub observes a feature of the landscape that is novel but not threatening. The mother in those recordings is, in most cases, not in the full concealment posture either. She is alert, she is watching, but she is not urgently repositioning to maximize the distance from the stimulus. She is allowing the exposure, and the cub is recording that allowance as a lesson in how this stimulus category is to be regarded. The footage is not dramatic. It does not look like the precursor to an attack, because it is not the precursor to an attack. The vast majority of the cubs captured in those recordings will grow into adults that never harm a person. The footage documents a process that is subtle and slow and expressed statistically rather than individually. The risk it represents is not legible in any single recording. It becomes legible when you aggregate across hundreds of recordings, across years of collar data, across the incident record, and ask what the relationship is between the behavioral profile documented in the developmental period and the behavioral profile documented in the adult that eventually appears in an incident report. The radio collar study asked exactly that question. The answer it found was not definitive proof of a causal mechanism. It was a consistent and statistically detectable association that points toward a causal mechanism, and that the existing science of observational learning in felids provides a coherent, theoretical framework for understanding. The ethical dimension of this situation is not simple. The mountain lion is a species of profound ecological importance and extraordinary biological interest. It is a keystone predator whose presence in the landscapes of the American West structures prey population dynamics, vegetative communities, and the behavior of a wide range of species that are influenced by the risk landscape the lion creates. Its conservation status in most of its range is secure in gross population terms, but fragile in ways that the connectivity and habituation issues reveal. Fragile not because the lions are dying in large numbers, but because the behavioral and demographic conditions they are being asked to live in are not sustainable at the trajectory they are currently on, without consequences for the animals and for the people who share their landscape. Advocating for honest communication about the risks that developmentally habituated mountain lions present to people is not advocacy against mountain lion conservation. It is advocacy for the kind of informed public understanding that produces sustainable coexistence, rather than the kind of managed ignorance that stores up a political crisis for the moment when the incident record becomes impossible to explain with the language of extreme rarity. The public understanding of mountain lions in the American West is shaped almost entirely by two competing narratives that are both oversimplifications. The first is the conservation narrative that emphasizes the lion's ecological importance, the extreme rarity of attacks, the human responsibility for habitat encroachment, and the need for protective management. This narrative is largely correct and is advocating for things that are genuinely in the interest of both the lions and the people who live in the landscape with them. The second is the danger narrative that is activated by high-profile incidents and that tends toward the kind of species-level risk inflation that produces political pressure for hunting expansion and reduced protections. This narrative is largely incorrect as a statistical matter and has historically produced conservation damage that outweighs any legitimate safety benefit. What is missing from the space between these narratives is a third account that is honest about the direction of the trend, specific about the mechanisms that are driving it, clear about the structural conditions that need to be addressed, and appropriately contextual about the actual magnitude of the risk, without either minimizing it into invisibility or inflating it into a crisis. The radio collar study data, the camera trap records, the behavioral ecology of observational learning in mountain lion cubs. All of this belongs to that third account. It is being collected by researchers who understand it clearly. It is not reaching the public that needs it. The 27 people killed by mountain lions in 4 centuries of North American recorded history are not a prologue to a catastrophe. The species is not transitioning into a human predator, and will not. The rarity is built into its biology at a level that developmental habituation does not override, and that even extreme nutritional stress only modifies at the margins and in specific conditions. But the margin is changing. The conditions are becoming more common. The developmental experience of a growing proportion of mountain lion cubs in the American West is being shaped by the same human-penetrated landscape that is producing the gradual behavioral drift that the collar data documents. The adults those cubs become will be making their predatory and avoidance decisions from a set of calibrations that are systematically different from those of the wild, conditioned lions that the historical baseline describes. Not dramatically different. Not so different that the baseline of rarity loses its relevance as the primary statistical context, but different in ways that are detectable, directional, and tied to structural conditions that are continuing to develop rather than diminishing. The mountain lion that drops out of a tree above a trail runner at dusk on a California coastal trail is not a category error. It is a predictable output of a landscape-scale process that nobody designed, that nobody wanted, and that the scientific community has been quietly documenting for the past decade in datasets that the public has not been given a clear account of. The radio collar study that produced the developmental exposure finding was not designed to tell a story about danger. It was designed to tell a story about behavior. The story about behavior turned out to have implications that go beyond what the researchers were looking for. Implications for management, for public communication, for the future of an extraordinary species in an increasingly compromised landscape. Those implications deserve a clear and honest accounting. The mountain lion deserves that accounting. The people who recreate in its habitat, raise children in its range, and walk their dogs in its territory deserve that accounting. The space between extreme rarity and genuine trend is where the real conversation needs to happen, and the radio collar study that nobody expected has given us better tools to have it than we have ever had before.